It's been a week since our last Property Insider chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson. And while we were planning to give you an update today on the COVID-19 situation in our property markets, it's really hard to know where to start. So much has changed over the last week. And by the time you get to watch this video, it's likely a whole lot more changes will have occurred. But let's have a chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Australia's leading housing economist, chief economist of myhousingmarket.com.au. Welcome, Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Certainly it's been an unprecedented week, and I think these unprecedented times will continue for some time yet, but let's hope it does end sooner rather than later.
Well, that's what everyone wants, because as you say, we are living in extraordinary times, and let's be blunt, they are challenging times. The coronavirus is first and foremost a major public health issue, but clearly it's actually developed into a major economic problem and having deep ramifications for financial systems right around the world. Now, they're not my words, they're actually the words of Philip Lowe, Governor of the Reserve Bank. And I was comforted to hear his continuing words where he reminded us that as our country manages this difficult situation, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that we are going to come through this. So the Governor of the Reserve Bank was talking about, and Scott Morrison, about building bridges to help us get to the other side. So their focus is on supporting businesses and households who are going to suffer. We're all going to take a hit to our incomes at the moment. And while I'd like to discuss what they're doing in a moment, Andrew, I think it's important to discuss the big factor that's concerning people with property at the moment, that our housing markets are going to shut down to a degree, if not completely, for a few weeks or more. Recently, the Prime Minister announced new restrictions on social gatherings, and that stopped open homes or public open homes. It stopped auctions. And while it could mean that there's still going to be private sales occurring through private inspections, it's not too long before further restrictions are going to occur, even maybe before people watch this video, Andrew, where they may not even be able to go to those. So what does this mean for our property market?
Well, yes, Michael, it's unprecedented in terms of being almost a stop to buying and selling activity. Typically, we see the ebb and the flow of the cycle, and we obviously get trends. We saw a quickly moving market upwards at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, and the reverse, of course, through the end of 2018 when markets were falling sharply. And of course, the reason there was sharply declining buyer activity. There was the fear factor that had moved into our housing markets. Buyers decided all those, as now have been proved, ridiculous predictions of catastrophic price falls. Buyers, not surprisingly, sat on their hands through the end of 2018 and into 2019, but the market did recover, as we know. Confidence returned. It was a cyclical factor. It was really something where eventually the underlying fundamentals kicked in and the market regained ground quite quickly in Melbourne and Sydney and was just about to get back to its previous peaks when along comes the coronavirus. And of course, that means all bets are off. And that's why this is an unprecedented event, because it's, to a large degree, Michael, it's just basically saying, look, we're going to stop any buying and selling that's going on. Now, obviously, you can't do that as a pronouncement, but the point is that not just the fear factor now, and people will be concerned about the future. That will mean that those buyers and sellers that are discretionary will sit on their hands and wait, as we saw in 2018 and early 2019. Probably will even have fewer of those non-discretionary sellers in the marketplace, those that sadly are confronted with death or divorce or moving interstate. I think even those factors will be put to one side in terms of those activities being halted, which will mean even fewer of those non-discretionary sellers in the marketplace. So it does mean that we're going to get very few sales going through the system, almost an unprecedented collapse in sales, I believe, in the offing. And it's not just a question of the fear factor, it's also the issues of not being able to conduct business as we're used to conducting business in a face-to-face environment, whether it's the auction, the open house inspection, the negotiation, whatever it may be in terms of property buying and selling. That's certainly going to be severely constrained. Unfortunately, when these events occur, because the few sellers that are left in the marketplace typically have to sell, we do see price models obviously tracking sharply downwards, which tends to reinforce the negativity and the fear factor from sellers, and that does take some time to recover. But look, I guess we've just got to hang on to our hats, Michael, wait for this to pass. It is a health issue. It's nothing to do with the economy per se or the housing market per se. That was kicking along quite nicely to start the year this year, and the prospects for a strong year were certainly quite solid. But of course now, as I said, all bets are off, and we just have to wait for this health issue to be resolved sooner rather than later. And then we can take off, not quite where we left off, but certainly I think we'll build a little bit quicker into a recovery in the housing market than we've done when markets have declined because of underlying cyclical factors.
Because the underlying factors are still positive: strong
Yes.
population growth, the lowest interest rate ever, the
Yep.
cheapest it is to hold on to a house. People are still getting married, still getting divorced, still having babies, needing to move house. The problem is, Andrew, some people are going to get caught in this vortex.
Yes.
There are some people who sold a while ago and have now put their properties up for auction. We were coming up to
Yes.
the peak auction season.
Yeah.
They're going to be in limbo.
Yes, look, this is obviously a conundrum for those. And I think we do have to look to governments to be able to ease that financial stress on those sellers that have committed themselves to a contract, that obviously have to meet that contract, but that purchased a property and in the prospect of selling their property to fund that purchase. And now, obviously, with the prospects of a sale being certainly more remote than they were when the market was up and running a month or so ago. So, I mean, what do you do? People have to be able to given some breathing space. This is the role for government now. Government have mandated these policies as a risk management factor for the coronavirus. They now have to be able to support all those as innocent victims, financial victims.
Well, the government's working its way through support. So they're talking about support to tenants, support to landlords, residential and commercial, and that will probably occur over the next little while anyway. They're giving support now. Andrew, I'm concerned that is there going to be enough in the coffers to give support at the right time, because we've got to get through
Yes.
this. But once we get
Yes.
through this, and we will, and it'll probably be 3, 4, 5 weeks, we actually
Yes.
need to get industry going again.
Yep.
Will they be able to do that?
Well, that's important, Michael, that we differentiate between what is now the risk management period and then the recovery period. Now, the recovery period, as said before, hopefully will be sooner rather than later. I think a month's about it from my mind. I think after a month of these draconian restrictions, really we're going to start to be creating more problems than we're trying to solve. And I mean in terms of health problems as well. So we need to be quite circumspect about that. Governments need to be mindful of the damage this is going to cause and to be able to balance the mitigation policies against what their effects will be, not just on the economy, but potentially on health as well. But I think that we need to be ready to go with unprecedented stimulus package once we're moving through the quarantine process. I mean, obviously people have to be supported in the short term in terms of being able to sustain themselves. But I think that in terms of getting the economy up and running again, we need to go in with all guns blazing as soon as people can go back to work and as soon as businesses can start to regenerate themselves. This is where governments have, obviously a key role, but they have a moral role as well to be able to do whatever it takes, spend whatever they have to get our economy up and running again. And as we have discussed previously, Michael, our economy, compared to most of other advanced economies, at least is in reasonable shape to be able to do that.
Well, in his speech recently, Reserve Bank Governor Lowe said that Australia has a strong financial system. It's well placed to provide the needed support to businesses and to households. He said the system's got a strong capital and liquidity position.
Yes.
And APRA has also confirmed that there is large buffers of capital and liquidity in the system. That's a bit different to last time during the global financial crisis. Liquidity dried up. Money was hard to get. We're in a better position this time around.
Well, the point is that there's, even though it's a little peculiar, there's more certainty now because this is a health issue where we're not allowed to mix, where we have to remain confined. As long as we can sustain ourselves in terms of paying our bills and obviously food and clothing, these types of essentials, then we will wait this thing through. In the global financial crisis, we were facing a global economic shock. We didn't know where it would lead to, and we get issues to do with the financial sector, such as the potential for a run on the bank. Now, these things start to foment when you do have these sharp declines in economic activity. And the government stepped in during the GFC because there was a sense that the banks didn't have the capacity to guarantee all their funding. And of course, now the Commonwealth now guarantees all deposits in banks. So we don't have to worry about that as a potential negative for people being concerned about having liquid assets. And of course, these days we don't have cash as a commodity as we used to. Now most of our transactions are done in a digital environment. So really that's a good thing in a way that we don't have to worry about that prospect of having to have enough cash on hand to be able to survive, and therefore we go to the bank to withdraw all our cash. That's a good thing about this environment, is we learnt that lesson from the GFC period. At least we can be positive because the evidence as it's revealed has shown that there is a finite period to this illness, that it has moved through other countries where it was an early stage issue, such as China, South Korea. So we know that this hopefully will have an end to it sooner rather than later. But as I said, the main game then will become recovery. And for the property market, perhaps, if anything can be a positive, maybe in the best of circumstances, we're basically having a longer winter selling season, Michael, and we can start thinking about a revival in spring. And I think, which we haven't sort of mentioned, governments would be mindful of previous experience in terms of regenerating our economy to look to the property market as a toolkit for that, as we've seen previous governments do during times of financial stress.
Well, I remember way back, Bob Hawke got
Yes.
first homeowner grants, getting the construction industry going, and what that made people do was buy televisions and refrigerators and
Yeah, that's right.
It's a great way of getting industry going, isn't it?
Well, it is, Michael, and I think we've already seen the energy that a handout to first home buyers can create in the housing market. We see that, as you said, Bob Hawke brought that in '83 following a severe and a sharp recession. We then saw Rudd introduce that during the GFC 2009, we had the first home buyer deposit boost, which was a great fillip for the economy. And as you said, there's plenty of tentacles that come out as a result of energising the housing market, construction, white goods, all these bits and pieces that are associated. And it really is a strong driver of economic energy when it's activated. And we still have plenty of aspiration for home ownership. Plenty of first home buyers would want to get into the housing market. And I think that governments should think about a real significant boost to first home buyer buying capacity when we move into this recovery phase. I think there are other mechanisms we can think about also, Michael. I think we can think about regenerating, as I said, housing market activity by perhaps introducing something we haven't had, and that's tax deductions for mortgages. We can think about a mechanism whereby new mortgages for a period of time are allowed to be tax deducted. We can also think about mechanisms for activating those risk takers in property, such as developers, such as investors, to give them some accelerated access to cheap finance for them to become active, as I said, in residential investment or property development. So I think there are avenues for the government to use through property to be able to regenerate our economy sooner rather than later, as has been proved in the past.
People are losing their jobs, and there's a number of economists coming out with suggestions of 7%, 10%, double-digit unemployment rates. Recession seems certain, but the pessimists are out again. They're using the D word this time. I told you so, they're telling us we're going to have a depression, Andrew.
Well, they don't know what they're talking about, Michael. This is all guesswork. It's headline chasing, and it is all guesswork. They don't have a clue what they're talking about. They're just picking a number and hoping they'll be right. We shouldn't be playing this game, how high unemployment's going to go. We should be working on mechanisms to reduce any unemployment that we do get coming through, rather than looking at some sort of a numbers game, some sort of a prediction, crystal ball gazing environment. And that's it. They have no idea what they're talking about. And it's just guesswork at the end of the day, because nobody knows. We don't even know how long this particular episode is going to run. And a lot will depend on the government action to offset the negatives. And as we said at the beginning, this country is fortunate, very strong exporter still. Iron ore and coal is still finding customers. We have a small population. We were roughly in budget surplus in the last budget, whereas most other countries are in a budget deficit position. If you look at the US has a $1 trillion, well, had a $1 trillion deficit before the coronavirus issue, which was 4% of GDP. So we're not even close to that, or we're certainly not close to that prior to the coronavirus. And of course, the US is pump priming and prepared to stimulate its economy too. So we don't have to worry about the ideological claptrap of not going into deficit, which has been holding us back to some degree, and also any worries about overheating parts of the economy through a stimulus package. Let's take a cold shower, guys, and forget playing the name game and chasing headlines with these sort of scare tactics.
Well, the government's given incentives to people on low incomes, people who've lost their job, but they've also given a $90 billion economic stimulus package to the banks, and they're encouraging them to lend and lend at particularly low interest rates. And that's good. And the banks are open for business, and the banks are also there if you're running into trouble to either pause or reduce your payments as well. So this is unprecedented in my experience, and the banks are stepping in very early to underpin our economies, our own personal budgets, and the property market.
Well, banks have a moral obligation, Michael, to do this. Let's remember that we have a very strong banking sector for banks. This strong banking sector with obviously low levels of competition, high levels of market power, has been allowed by our government so we can have a highly risk managed financial sector. That's a good thing. It means that we don't take risks with our borrowing because banks can afford to be not inclined to follow the market dynamic, and that's because they can make profits through the cycles and business cycles. But this is the time where banks have to stand up and they have to offset, I guess, the corporate agenda of profit chasing and start to realise that they're in a position because of the political strength or the political outcomes of the government allowing this type of, or this banking sector with strong market power. And therefore we need that market power now to be delivered and likely offset against bank profits to be able to see us recover sooner rather than later.
We will get through this, not just because of the government, because of the resilience of Australians. And it's actually good to see people helping each other, people being compassionate, looking after each other. So I look forward to having a chat again next week. Boy, we're going to have a lot of things to discuss, but what we're probably not going to discuss next week are the auction clearance rates.
Yes, Michael, this is quite extraordinary. This has come at the wrong time for the market in a sense that we were expecting an absolute truckload of auctions prior to the Easter break. We had with our quieter market a year ago, sellers were quite reticent to get into the marketplace. So we've had a flood of selling activity this year, reflecting what's strong competition amongst buyer for property. Now, we were looking at thousands of properties going under the hammer in the 2 weekends before the Easter break. In fact, the highest number of properties being offered for years. Now, of course, the people have made decisions to go to auction prior to the coronavirus issue. They've committed themselves to marketing campaigns. They've paid money, life's on hold. Now, we're going to see virtually that stop, not just what we're discussing before as a reflection of people's concerns, but also because we've now seen open for inspections and public auctions being banned. And I guess if we want to speculate, I'm not sure what the relevance of an auction clearance rate will be going forward, because it's not a market reflection. It's just a reflection of the constraints for buyers and sellers.
Just as auction clearance rates won't be that relevant, I think median prices or sale price statistics,
absolutely,
a very small market is not going to be relevant either. But people are going to come out with headlines saying, look, property prices have dropped 10, 15, 20% because there's been 2 sales. That doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't, Michael. And again, it's useless to speculate on how far prices, I've been asked how far prices are going to fall. It really doesn't have much relevance because it's not reflecting market value. There'll only be a handful of properties transacted. It's not really reflecting underlying value in our properties. That will come back when the economy is back where it should be.
We need to get some volume back into the market again. Look forward to our chat next week, and I bet you there's going to be quite a few things changing between now and then.
Let's hope there's some better news, Michael.
Looking forward to it. Well, there is good news. We've only spoken about negatives, so let's finish off with the fact that there are people who've almost found vaccines. They're trialing vaccines.
Yes. Oh,
The
absolutely.
number of new cases in China have decreased. You've got to look
Yes.
for the good news too, don't you?
Well, as I said, Michael, on the exposed evidence, this thing has a finite life. And with a bit of luck, it'll be sooner rather than later. There has to be, obviously, economic ramifications. Governments are there to make sure that has as minimal impact on Australians as possible once this health issue is behind us.
I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. Thanks for your time, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael. Good on you.